welcome to this virtual open day taster lecture. Well, actually, short talk. Thank you so much for coming. Look, these are very strange times, and that's why I'm sorry I'm giving you this talk in this rather messy office of mine at home. I thought I'd sort of perk things up a bit by putting this messy office in a rather celestial context, but still, it's terrible that you can't be here, and that's a real shame. You don't get to see our lovely lecture rooms and a lovely building, and more importantly, you don't get to meet the staff and other people like you who are thinking of applying to Cambridge. The idea of this taster lecture is really just to expose you to some of the ways of thinking and ideas that we have in the faculty, and I'm going to pick on a particular story which I hope in microcosm will bring together some of the approaches and themes that are of interest to people within the discipline. Now, normally, when there's any kind of teaching in Cambridge, it's rather an interactive sort of experience. In other words, the lecturer doesn't just lecture at you and then leave, although I've occasionally done that. The main point really is that there's an interaction. Now, that really occurs primarily in the supervisions, which are really a wonderful opportunity for you to pick the brains and also have your own brains picked by world experts in various areas that you'll be taught. But also happens in seminars and also the lectures. You know, I'll often fire out a question, and at the end maybe you too will ask questions. That interactivity is really important in the development of your own thinking about the subject. As you're not here, I've got to get a stand-in replacement, so I'll be delivering this little short talk to my friend. Let's go there. Yes, my friend Tux. So, right. Well, then I think we should get on with it. Okay, so what I want to do is look at a particular incident that happened in Cambridge and explore it through three documents. Two of which we have and one of which is missing, and that actually isn't that unusual for the study of religion, where it often turns out that rather crucial documents are missing, or even more fascinatingly, some crucial documents will come to light, like for example the Gospel of Thomas or the Dead Sea Scrolls or something like that, which will then cause people to think again about fundamental issues. So anyway, two documents we've got, one we haven't. Now, this is the first document, 1659. Now, it's a very interesting document. It tells a story about an accusation of witchcraft in Cambridge, that this woman, Mary Phillips, claimed that she'd been turned into a horse, and then she'd been ridden from a village of Dinton. She'd been ridden by a couple of witches up to somewhere called Madinley Hall, we'll come on to in a minute, which is a 16th century hall just outside Cambridge, and there the witches got off and then went into the hall and supped with the devil, quite literally, had a meal with the devil. Anyway, when she had come back to her senses and had returned to being a human being, she thought that really wasn't on, so she took the witches to court. So this is an account of her claims. So this is the first document, strange and terrible news. Now, we have to think about the context of this kind of document. Now, the first one, what interests me here is the, if you like, the geographical, cultural context, which I've just mentioned. This place called Madinley Hall, which is part of Cambridge University. There it is. Really interesting 16th century building, which was built from bits and pieces of something called Anglesey Abbey as a result of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. Now, not all of Cambridge looks like this, but it is quite pretty. It's just outside Cambridge, in a small village just outside Cambridge, actually being put to quite good use at the moment as a hostel for NHS key workers. But anyway, there it is, just outside Cambridge. So we're going to see that the court case actually takes place in Cambridge. So the university gets involved, and the scholars and things are involved in this accusation of witchcraft, which might surprise you because you may think, hold on, what are these academics doing in the 17th century taking these kinds of things seriously? Well, we'll discover that they did, that this didn't, although people accuse academics of living in ivory towers, and I'm sure some do, they also very much involved in the everyday town life and wider civic life, so they were quite important. So Madinley Hall is only just outside Cambridge. That's why the trial takes place in Cambridge and draws in some academics. Now, what about the charge of witchcraft? Now, what's really interesting about this charge is, look, on one level, some of you may be familiar with sacred texts that say that witchcraft's not a good idea. So you can turn to the Bible, and obviously the Bible is the kind of key religious document for 17th century England. And there you have biblical prohibitions against witchcraft, like Deuteronomy 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And you find similar things, Deuteronomy 18, etc. But of course, the Bible, although it's foundational within the culture at the time, isn't itself law. Instead, you have English and Scottish, obviously, law. And here, in this case, English law. And what's taking place here is a trial under the 1604 Witchcraft Act, which is a very interesting law, partly seems to have been shaped by James I's obsession with witchcraft. Anyway, the punishment there is that people will be put to death by hanging if they're found guilty of being a witch having practiced witchcraft. Now, that might not surprise you, because in popular myth you would probably think, well, frankly, in the Middle Ages, everybody was, tons of witches were being hanged. That's there were hundreds of thousands of them being executed, and that's very much a kind of a popular image, but actually slightly more complicated, because it was only in 1542 that there was actually the first law outlawing witchcraft in England. Previously, these kind of activities had gone under a different kind of category of idolatry or whatever. So actually, it looks like witchcraft has kind of bubbled up in this period, or at least people's obsession with it. And in terms of the number of people killed, well, that's a massive intellectual argument. You might say, well, hold on, these are real people, you shouldn't get too intellectual about it. But actually the numbers, because you get estimates, in the tens, hundreds of thousands, but actually somebody like Malcolm Gaskell, real kind of expert in the field, but puts it at about 1,000 between 1450 and 1700 in England. Now, of course, that's 1,000 awful, unnecessary deaths. But you see, there is a kind of a popular cultural myth about this whole business of witchcraft. In some ways, it's fed by this kind of thing. This is a book by somebody called Matthew Hopkins, who's popularly known as the Witchfinder General. And there you can see, references to biblical texts there about witchcraft. And he's very famous for, between sort of about 1645, 1647, he's responsible for the death of well over 100 witches, particularly in the east of England. He went around accusing people and then engaging in various sort of techniques to find out whether they really were a witch or not. And Matthew Hopkins has had a massive kind of cultural impact. I'm sure very few people watching this will be aware of, but I don't want to be rude, slightly mediocre heavy metal band in the 1980s called Witchfinder General. And then there was also a film in 1968, Witchfinder General, which was a very influential film in its day. So he's kind of played continuously into popular culture, a rather unusual sort of character, quite famous for, if you like, dragging the devil into witchcraft, because now it seems kind of self-evident that people in this period would assume that the two things were related. They weren't necessarily related. And there was also a very specific Cambridge context to this accusations of witchcraft. So in 1645, for example, we know that an unfortunate woman was put to death, and the evidence against her was she had a pet frog, and which was regarded as a familiar, which some of you may know that kind of language referring to some sort of spirit, embodied sort of spirit that was under her control. So now we know about her death, though, and this is what's really important in studying any religious culture. Any time we know about her death because of a book written in 1655. So we know about the death of the woman with the frog by somebody called Thomas Addy, and that book is highly critical of accusations and belief in witchcraft. It's called A Candle in the Dark. And really it's scathing, and that itself develops a tradition which somebody called Reginald Scott had written a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, where he too was really sceptical of the existence of the supernatural and the whole accusation of witchcraft, saying that this was ludicrous. And these were both quite devout men in their own ways, but they didn't hold at all with this way of thinking. And that's very important to keep in mind when you study religion, which is the way that you get not necessarily everybody thinking the same way within a culture. Even if laws appear to reflect a certain kind of position, doesn't mean everybody held to them. Now, that context is obviously very important in Cambridge. Another context which I think is really crucial to keep in mind is the group that were being accused. Now, they're very interesting because in some ways, a modern scholar might say, what they are, they're just these two people accused of being witches are described as Quakers. Now, Quakers would fall into a kind of category of like a new religious movement, a group which used to be called a sect or cult, particularly. But these days scholars don't really like language like cult because it's a bit pejorative. But anyway, a new religious movement. So they had kind of come out of a sort of radical Puritanism, but only a few years really before this trial. And they were rather disliked now, like a lot of new religious movements today. You know, a new religion which emerges, particularly one which is somewhat confrontational and appears to be growing rather quickly, as this group did. Accusations were that it was going to take the country over. It never got over more than sort of 1% of the population, but it grew quite rapidly. They tend then to attract, the hostility of those who have a position of authority. And sometimes this Quaker group, they in a way kind of invert that because they themselves confront also this authority. I mean, Quakers were not kind of just passive victims of their own sort of persecution. They were notorious for doing things like breaking up church services and things in order to proclaim their understanding of the truth, as it were. Now, they were regularly associated with witchcraft really from the founding of the group, so that we know, for example, in 1655 you have two books published, one called The Devil's Pilgrimage in England, or The Quaker's Dream, or The Devil's Pilgrimage in England, another called The Quaker's Terrible Vision, or The Devil's Progress in the City of London. So that just shows how the language of witchcraft is associated with this group. Now, why are they treated this way? Well, actually, let's have a look at a picture for a moment. This is a picture done by somebody called Egbert van Heemskerk, who was a Dutch artist, and it's a very interesting picture because in some ways it illustrates what I've been talking about. So you have this woman in the middle of the room, and if you look at the details, you can see she's wearing on her head. It looks like a sort of a rather witchy hat there. You also see some cats depicted at the back, and also you can see the way the artist has demonstrated his own attitude towards this rather odd group by the dog, for example. You can see urinating on the woman's dress in the corner. So he's really summing up this kind of, trying to depict them as rather a witchy group, as it were. But they didn't self-identify in that kind of way at all. They consider themselves, if anything, the kind of complete opposite. But actually this picture indicates the way that they, and in a way often more recent new religious movements, can get under people's skin. Because what's going on here? There's a woman in the middle of the room preaching. Now, the Quakers had their own reasons for why they allowed women to preach. They believed that the text, Joel 2:28, they saw embodied in their movement. Now, Joel 2:28 is this kind of a prophetic expectation. It says, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. So, there's a lot of potential for you to study biblical texts and things in this degree, and you'll see that kind of the interpretation of text is so dependent upon sort of context. And here we've got a group who consider themselves embodying this, and so they do something rather radical, having these women preachers. It wasn't that women didn't preach before them. In the English Revolution, you get Baptists and other women preaching, but this group made it absolutely central to their identity and stuck to it. And this is a long time before mainstream denominations had women who were ordained. So that kind of socially disruptive practice kind of attracted the sort of hostility towards them, although they themselves did do some other rather surprising things. I mean, some of them, for example, took a lead from Isaiah 20, where the prophet Isaiah describes as going around naked as a sign, and similarly wandered around naked as a sign normally of judgment or whatever against people in the British Isles and beyond in this period. So there's things that provoked people on the other side too. Now, back to this kind of context. So these people had belonged to this group, the ones accused of witchcraft in Cambridge. The group itself had been in Cambridge only a few years after it started. It started in the kind of Midlands and north of England. And within a few years, it was all over the British Isles and in North America and Europe, and then beyond, really, within sort of 3 or 4 years. So in 1653, a woman called Mary Fisher, for example, came to Cambridge with another woman, and they would understand themselves as prophets. And she was been imprisoned. She was somebody who was a servant from Yorkshire, and she wasn't slow at coming forward. And when she was in Cambridge, she attacked verbally the students of Sydney Sussex College, saying that they really shouldn't be trained to be priests, because Quakers were very opposed to any kind of concept of of priesthood, and for her efforts she was then stripped and whipped through the streets of Cambridge. She then went off to Boston, Massachusetts, to proclaim more or less the same message there, but they didn't let her in. The Puritans there put her in a prison and checked her out, seeing if she was a witch or not, and then booted her out from Boston. She was quite lucky. A few years later, a number of members of this group would be hanged in Boston by the Puritans. So anyway, she carries on in her journeys. In 1658, she gets to Adrianople to speak to Mehmet IV, who was the Ottoman Sultan. So it's fascinating, this kind of story of what's going on in Cambridge. Really, part of its kind of origins lies in this activity of a woman who's associated with a bunch of people in this movement who actually engage in this really interesting kind of intercultural encounter, if you like, because she goes to see Mehmet IV. There he is, very important. The Ottoman Empire is extremely important, and he was incredibly powerful. And what's interesting is she goes to see him because she believes that she has a message for him, a prophetic message for him. And according to her account, they have a rather nice conversation. And unlike the people in Boston, Massachusetts, or in Cambridge, she didn't get stripped or treated as and whipped or treated as a witch or anything. He treats her with respect. And when they finish their conversation about their respective beliefs, he offers her a military escort home, which she declines. So I really wanted, it may seem like a bit of an excursus that, but I wanted to show how we're focusing on a very local event, but actually you can see how the people involved, directly or indirectly involved in things that actually have this kind of global consequences, and really quite fascinating intercultural, interreligious encounter, which again is something which the degree is very interested in, lots of opportunities pursuing that. So that's a very important context too, the Quaker in Cambridge context. Another context to bear in mind is back to that original text, the Strange and Terrible News from Cambridge. It's rather sensational work, and if you looked at it in more detail, you'd think, well, it's not particularly well written, and it really is representative of a genre of literature. And again, genre is something we really think about in the degree, because you can't assume that everybody reading texts agrees with them in a straightforward way or reads them only in one kind of way. So what kind of genre is it? Well, people would recognise it at the time as being something that referred to as a chapbook or a cheap book. These are often very sensational texts that the content is rather exciting but rather unbelievable often. So, for example, you get Strange and Terrible News from like Sussex about a big snake, a big serpent sort of eating people and things, or earthquakes in Cumbria, or fairies, and all sorts of things like that. And people kind of knew these were sensational sorts of texts, but they're very popular as a result, telling these really interesting stories. But they were also known colloquially as bum fodder. In other words, these weren't the sort of things you would really treasure and pass on to your children. You're more likely to use them as toilet paper. So that's the kind of literature which is giving us this account. That's quite important. We'll come on to that in a second. Now then, to the second text. This is the one we've lost. Second text which we've lost is actually by John Bunyan. Now, some of you may have heard of John Bunyan. John Bunyan is one of the most influential writers in the English language. His The Pilgrim's Progress is one of the biggest selling books of all time in English. Went to hundreds and hundreds of editions, still very well known, an absolute spiritual classic. What's really interesting is he wrote a text which is lost. Now, he has had, and relates specifically to this trial. Now, the text seems to be, and we can piece it together from other texts, a text in which he argued that the Quakers accused of witchcraft were indeed guilty of it, and they deserved the death penalty. Now, that might come as a bit of a surprise, because John Bunyan, he's a man himself, went to prison for his beliefs rather famously, and he's operating not too far away in the kind of Bedford area. Some of you may not really associate such kind of spiritual giant with this kind of calling for the death penalty for witchcraft. But he had tussles with the Quakers before. In fact, the first book he ever wrote was an attack on Quakers. Now, what's interesting about this document is it's missing. So you ask yourself, why is it missing? Because actually we've got a lot of his work. Now, Bunyan specialists will probably have tell me off for this, but one possibility is it may be missing because it's kind of text you don't really want to preserve necessarily. It doesn't show in the best light. It's one of his earlier kind of writings, and maybe doesn't reveal the kind of spiritual giant kind of characteristics that we know him, that we know about him from his Pilgrim's Progress and other texts. Okay, then on to the third document, the document that we have. In fact, the document we have, the next document that we actually have, is one that tells us about Bunyan's text. And this is it. Now, what's interesting about this text is it actually gives us an account of the trial and the acquittal of those people accused of witchcraft, which also, is worth bearing in mind. Sometimes people could be found innocent. And it's interesting to think why they were found innocent, because it doesn't just tell us about this very specific event, but tells us about bigger cultural shifts that are going on at the time. Now, let's just look at this document. This document is actually written by somebody who identifies themselves as being a member of this group, of being a Quaker. It's published by one of their publishers in London. And it's somebody called James Blakely. And what's interesting about James Blakely is he's an example of somebody who had joined the movement, and he's somebody who had actually been a former mayor of Cambridge. So this is a pretty powerful kind of character. And he's defending these people who are accused of witchcraft. Now, if you were in that kind of position of power and you joined a new religious movement, much as today, if some famous politician or celebrity joined a rather obscure religious movement, it may turn out that people use that against them. So he wasn't necessarily in an easy situation in making this kind of statement. But he gives what he believes is a pretty straightforward account to tell people what really happened. And he starts off by correcting all the faults. Because in the first text, the actual faults of fact, they got the name wrong of the woman who was making the accusation. They got the names of those who were accused wrong. They got the place that she came from wrong. All these sort of details that are just wrong. But what's perhaps most interesting is that he also gives us the details of the defence that the Quakers made. Now, some of this is of a kind of a theological kind, you can imagine, very devout religious people that disagree with each other, but they will kind of fight over the same kind of ground. And the Quakers turn this accusation of sort of witchcraft and whatever back on the people accusing them, saying, look, if you're saying we turned a woman into a horse, then according to the Bible, which you venerate so much, that would make us more powerful than the magicians in Egypt. And those who don't know it, this is a very famous sort of story of this kind of magical battle, Moses and Aaron against the magicians of Egypt in the Exodus narrative. So they're saying, look, they couldn't even turn a woman into a horse. But also, alongside this kind of theological sort of defence, they make a really important point, which is indicative of this cultural sort of shift, because they use a rational explanation against these accusations to try and undermine the account that's being brought of what they allegedly did and what allegedly happened that night. So they say, look, you accuse us of turning into a horse, riding up to Madingley Hall, going into the hall and supping with the devil, and you said we ate mutton, rabbit and lamb. And then they say, but you say it was November. You can't get lamb in November. Now, some of you might say, hold on, that's just ridiculous, that's rather petty. But actually, it seems rather petty, because if you're going to talk about devils and horses, women being turned into horses, surely they could conjure up lamb. But in November. But it's a kind of rational attack, mutton, rabbit and lamb. So you can't get lamb in November. saying this just can't be true. And also she had said that her nightdress had got covered in blood because of the bridle, whatever they'd used to ride her up there. And they said, well, this is ridiculous. You know, horses don't wear nightdresses. So there are all sorts of things that just don't work in reality. And interesting enough, this may have persuaded the judge, because the judge actually says that, look, it's probably just all a bad dream. But he also says that the woman making the accusation may herself, frankly, is more likely to have been a witch than the people who are accused. And that's because she used various folk remedies afterwards to try and sort of ward off that sort of thing happening again. But that kind of, these rational defences are very interesting. And they're interesting because they may be indicative of this phenomenon which years ago somebody called Keith Thomas wrote about, which is this shift in the ideas, or the kind of fundamental ideas about reality that people had. So he wrote this book called Religion and Decline of Magic, and it's about this change in the 16th and 17th century when you move away from just knowing that the world has these supernatural powers and whatever in them, and that starts being critiqued and overturned, so much so that you'll get a trial. The last person executed for witchcraft in England, 1684, so a few years later, but then 1712, you get a very famous trial where when a woman's accused of witchcraft, the judge just says, look, this is ridiculous. I know of no law against somebody flying around on a broomstick. There's no law against that. In other words, he was kind of mocking the substance of accusations made against people, which is indicative of a shift, a fundamental shift. Now, we'll come back to that in a second. but I wanted to just briefly say something about this Cambridge context as well, because although we have Bunyan saying she should be put to death, it's clear from the text produced by the Quakers that a number of Cambridge scholars are siding with Bunyan and also want these people accused of witchcraft to be put to death, which again might surprise you. But, and you've got to be careful about generalisations here, but there is really quite a struggle going on within the university intellectually as well about the place of these kind of supernatural claims within everyday life and their believability. So a really key philosopher, who I have colleagues who study in some detail in the faculty, called Henry Moore, a leading Cambridge Platonist he's called, for example, wrote in support of a book by somebody called Joseph Glanville, and the book argued for the reality of witchcraft and magic. And Joseph Glanville was a philosopher too, but a member of the Royal Society. And for those who've ever heard of the Royal Society, that is, the foremost sort of scientific, philosophical sort of body in sort of in British cultural history. In fact, one of the earliest in the world. So the fact that these debates were taking place in that Royal Society and that Henry Moore waded in on the side of those people who believed in such things shows that Cambridge really, these ideas are very much up for grabs at the time. And we know in a kind of at the level of sort of gossip and such like that students are involved. So a couple of rather sensational stories that appear in chapbooks and things at the time. We know, for example, in 1647, there was at least a claim that a student had got stuck with their studies and made a pact with the devil, who promised to help them understand the book they were having real problems reading. And the devil said then, in fact, there would be such a success now as a scholar that they would become a doctor of divinity. But unfortunately, you shouldn't really make pacts with the devil. Never works out well. And the hapless student was found, according to this rather sensational text, floating in the River Cam, beautiful river you can punt along. Anyway, a couple of days later. And there's also an account at the time of a student asking a rather famous astrologer to tell them whether they should read Oriental languages or divinity as a degree. And astrology is fascinating because it kind of sits on that area at the time between recognised scientific kind of language and discourse and magical. Where does it fit? It's always kind of moving in and out of the two. But anyway, and I'm sure you are facing sometimes similar issues about which degree do you want to do. Okay, back to that cultural shift. This may be indicative of this trial. Well, what's really interesting is that cultural shift really happens formally by 1735, because in 1735 you get a new Witchcraft Act. So the 1604 one, which I'd mentioned earlier, famously, you are hanged if you're found guilty of witchcraft. But the point about the 1735 Act is that it's pretending witchcraft. In other words, the Act does not assume, so unlike the 1604 Act, the 1735 Act does not assume that witchcraft actually exists. So you can only be found guilty of pretending to be a witch. In other words, you claiming magical powers to manipulate people. And the law does not involve the death penalty, but just imprisonment. So that's a shift, and it reflects that, and it's very interesting, the relationship between religion and law, because in a way that law reflects a cultural change, but it also shapes one, doesn't it? Because it then sort of, if the law doesn't really believe in the existence of witchcraft, then it kind of rather takes it away from being something you'd accuse people of and be fearful of and everything like that. Now, I'm not saying law reflects society. Sometimes it leads it, sometimes it's a long way behind it. But in matters of religion, it's very interesting to see the interrelationship between the two. Now, what's interesting about the 1735 law is it stays on the books. It stays on the books all the way to 1951. Now, is that just because people are too lazy? There aren't that many prosecutions under that trial. But it really does. And there is fascinating, kind of one of the reasons for it eventually being repealed is this. This is a letter from Winston Churchill, 1944, and he's complaining about the fact that the Court of Justice in London is being taken up with a case of a woman being accused of witchcraft. And he can't believe that in a war they're expending so much effort dealing with a witchcraft trial. This is somebody called Helen Duncan, who seems, some kind of mediumship sort of that she claimed to have, that she sort of revealed a sinking of a ship which had been sunk, but it hadn't been, the information hadn't been made public anyway. And she's jailed in 1944 as a result of this. So eventually, in 1951, they do repeal this act. It's just regarded as a bit ridiculous. But now that's interesting, because then we have another law, and that law in a way recognises a religious shift in English and American culture, the emergence of another religious movement that really emerged after the First World War, and that is spiritualism, because the new act is called the Fraudulent Mediums Act. Now, the point here is that mediums are associated with spiritualism, and spiritualism had kind of developed into various churches. It's still with us today as a lively religious community found throughout the country. But mediums were associated with this movement, and look at the name of that act, the Fraudulent Mediums Act. And the point being made here is that it allows mediums who are sincere to work. The law is against those who claim to have those powers and use it to deceive or to make money from deception or from people. So you see a change in the law. Witchcraft's now disappeared, and also spiritualism is being sort of accepted by this act. But it also has another consequence. This is another indication of how fascinating these legal changes can be, and perhaps unintended consequences. Because by witchcraft being taken out of the law, it then means you can be a witch quite openly then in under English law. And you get somebody called Gerald Gardner, who'd already written about his claims that he had come into contact with a sort of long, suppressed but underground movement of which is going right back to sort of pre-Christian days, and he'd written about this their religion. And so after this law was passed, he could openly proclaim his message, publish it, and it is now one of the most vibrant forms of what's referred to as paganism or neo-paganism, which is Wicca. And that is often referred to as a new religious movement, because it really only became prominent from a Wiccan point of view. It only re-emerged, but perhaps from the view of some critics, it only kind of became sort of created in subsequent to this act. And you can see the debates between scholars as to exactly how much that kind of law impacted upon the development of that very vibrant and in popular culture extremely influential religious movement. Now, I'd just like to finish off with some sort of final reflections about this whole little talk. Take a step back for a moment and think a bit about how scholars often sort of look at these things and talk about them dispassionately and go, look at these people, let's try and understand them. But they sometimes forget about themselves in all of this. And the final point I'd like to make is it's a really interesting book by an anthropologist who worked on the religious beliefs of a group in northern Mozambique. So he spent some time working with them, trying to understand their culture. So Harry West, and what's really interesting about it is he tells a story about the beliefs of these people. So essentially, a number of them believed in the existence of things called sorcery lions. Now these were lions that were either sorcerers who transformed themselves into lions, or lions who were conjured up by sorcerers. And they apparently were incredibly dangerous threats to the members of the group that he was studying, and they because they could attack them and cause death and injury and that sort of thing. Now, he looked at this and said, well, what sense can I make of this? So he says, look, these are symbols. So he says, he interpreted them as symbols of the precarious lives that these people lived. In other words, the culture that they lived in was one in which power and illness and things like that were really out of their control. They were very vulnerable to things. And so one way of dealing with being vulnerable, according to quite a few kind of interpreters of culture, would be to have these kind of symbols of this precariousness. And so he said they kind of conjured up these lions, and they were there. That was their way of understanding these threats, and that they would try and deal with the lions, and in a way they were dealing really with this precarious living existence. Now, he gave a talk about this, and actually what was fascinating about it was in the audience were some members of this group, and they stopped him and said, these lions that you talk about, they aren't symbols, they're real. Or another one said, metaphors don't kill neighbours, lion people do. Now, that made him take a step back. Because on the one hand, you might say, look, hold on, it's just, that's all very well, but sorcery lies don't really exist or something like that. That's the way that some scholars might put it. But, if you're a scholar of religion, one of the really big issues that you have is how can you understand the ideas of people without at least finding some way of entering into their world. But how do you do that? Because you can't really enter into somebody's world. So there's a famous debate about being an insider and an outsider. But it did remind him that he had used a language about symbols in order to say what he thought was really going on when these people talked about sorcery lions. And some of you may have come across terms like reductionism and things like that as a way of saying, well, claims of religion are really about something else, and we can explain them in these various kinds of ways, etc., etc. But it made him take a step back, because it made him think for a moment that, look, scholars can't just stand there, and students can't just stand there and talk about what people really mean without at least turning the spotlight on themselves for a moment. And it made him think. And he thought, look, by using the language of symbolism, he was, in a sense, reshaping these people and their world in accordance with his own vision. And he said, if I'm doing that kind of thing, then surely that constitutes a form of sorcery. It made him wonder what kind of sorcerer a scholar really is. Now, I'll leave you to think about that. If you're a little concerned about exactly what he meant, I haven't done him justice, I do apologise. It's not a very long book. Do have a read, very readable book. Very engaging, and an example of the kind of things you'll read when you come here. So, just to wrap it up, I hope this has been interesting and engaging. I hope you've seen along the way I've tried to draw out some of the kind of big themes, the sort of things that we will examine, and the questions about method and history and text and anthropology and all these various things that you'll look at if you do the degree here. So I would just like to conclude by thanking you and wishing you good luck. And so would my friend. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.